So good morning, good day, or good afternoon to everyone from all around the world for joining us today. We're super excited to have you with us for a quick webinar and demo about automating the development process. Good morning, good day, or good afternoon to everyone from decentralized apps with Tenderly's Web3 actions. So before I hand it off to Luca to kick us off, I just wanted to let you know that we'll hold a live Q&A session at the end of the demo. So during the webinar, feel free to send any questions you might have about Tenderly, Web3 actions, or anything else really in the Q&A box on Zoom. So without further ado, I'm handing the reins over to Luca. So Luca, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do at Tenderly, and what we'll be learning from you today?
Yeah, so thank you for a great introduction, and thank you all for joining me today. My name is Luca, and I'm DevRel at Tenderly. So my team is trying to bridge the gap and explain what we do and how to help people that are using our products in much more broad way. So on that topic, the goal of our Tenderly webinar today is to talk about Web3 actions and how to build certain automation around your dApps. So that being said, I set a goal for us today here. After this 30 minutes or so webinar, after you close down this webinar, I want you to have just a little bit of more understanding of what are Web3 actions and how you can help using them to build better products and integrate in your existing or future products as well. To achieve that, we have 4 sections of today's webinar. We are going to start just a little bit of an introduction about Tenderly. So if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to provide you a bit of a context. Then we are going to switch the gears to more technical part of this whole webinar and explain the high level of Web3 actions, like what goes to building a single Web3 actions as well. Then we are going to put everything together into building a demo for tic-tac-toe game on chain. So we are going to utilize our product, and we are going to use tic-tac-toe Solidity contract that we are going to explore in a bit to build a fully functional Web3 game. And at the end, we are going to have a live Q&A. So if you have any questions for me or for my colleagues, we are there. Cool. So we are Tenderly, we are basically building a platform for you guys, for developers, to help you build better products. And on doing that, we have many tools that we built on that note. Here, you can see that they are separated in 3 different sections, starting from development to observability for your products, and finally infrastructure, which we are going to touch upon and explain the most in today's session. So we have for you, for example, in the development section, a debugger, simulator, and gas profiler, for example, to get the exact number or close to exact number of the gas needed either in simulations or in the real network. And today we are going to talk about the infrastructure part, where the Web3 actions comes into play of building more interactive and automated dApps that you can build on and expand in the future. Cool. So Web3 actions, we created them as serverless pieces of code that you can run based on some event that can happen either on-chain or off-chain. So we are going to, one amazing thing about that is you're going to define the behavior of those events that can either happen somewhere else or on chain that we're going to do today. And we made this to help you automate certain tasks, and you can focus on something that really matters to you, whatever that means, for example, core application. And that being said, we have some kind of a high level understanding of Web3 actions, but let's go deeper and see what it goes into building a single Web3 action. So there are 2 main parts as I separated for this talk. First one is the logic, the code that you're going to build. So it's going to run based on some criterion that we are going to set. And this is what? So we call this action functions. In a more technical point, it's just a JavaScript function or TypeScript function, depending on what you love. You would write it as you would generally function in these languages, but it has some nuances that we need to follow, so it's recognized by our engine as a Web3 action. So to have all the parts that comes into building this function, we need to export one. So the first thing that we need to do for each of these functions in our product is to export. So the Tenderly engine can recognize it and work with it. It will have some name. So basically that's for you. So naming convention applies as any other project. It is action function as a type, and it's always asynchronous function. For the parameters of this function, whenever you define this, it always have these two parameters, context and event. We are going to explore each of these events or context in a bit in the demo side of this webinar, but just so you know, it will always have only these two parameters, context and event. And obviously, after you define this function, it will have some code in it. So it's your logic. What needs to happen when that criterion is met? And that brings us to the second and the last part of each of these functions, which is when. We call these triggers. So triggers can have multiple sources, as I said, it can be either on-chain or off-chain. It really depends on what you would like to build in your application. And here on this slide, we have 4 different types of these events. So starting from the left, we have block event or block trigger. So this will monitor when something happens on chain, in this case, mining the block. So when the block gets mined and added to the chain, our system will recognize that and then run your code. And you can go into details like select the network and select how many blocks are going to be mined before we execute your code. And all of that we'll set that in a bit, but basically that's the first one. The periodic, if you work with the cron job, well, that's basically that. So it's a timer. You set when you want to run your code. It can be either a daily, monthly sometimes, or multiple times a day. Webhook, it's a self-explanatory one. So, and finally, we have a transaction. So in my opinion, it's the most interesting one, and that's why I chose to demonstrate it for you guys today. And it will tune to the transactions on a chain. In this case, we are going to wait and listen for events emitted from your Solidity contracts. So once your Solidity contract emits some event, our system will recognize that and say, hey, let's run this piece of code that we defined as a Web3 action. And this is the transaction trigger that we are going to use. And that's, in my opinion, as I said, one of the most interesting usabilities of our Web3 actions features. Cool. You will get the link to our GitHub repository now, so you can follow along the demos that we are going to work on. And obviously, if you have any questions about the code and stuff later on, you can ask, and we're going to talk about that. Great. So on the demo side, before we jump into our dashboard and start working and defining our first Web3 actions, I'd like you to introduce you to the smart contract that we need to use. So for this smart contract, I used Remix to deploy it on a test network called Gorley. So it's already deployed. It has this address. We will send you the code for everything after the session with this address as well. So if you don't want to deploy it yourself, you will be able to use our samples as well. Cool. So since this contract is a bit longer, I won't go into great details about what's happening in all of these parts. It's a bit longer, as I said. It's not difficult to understand. It's commented well. But as I said, if you have any questions after the session, if you don't follow along, for example, so please reach us out on Discord, for example, and we're going to talk about that. Cool. So it has multiple functions. It has some states, and the rest are basically helping helping functions to make this game work. But for today's session, we are only going to focus on events. And just imagine that we are working in a team, for example, and we have a blockchain developer that provided this Solidity contract to us and said, hey, we need some interactivity to build a front end, for example, and we want to inform users when something happens in this smart contract. So we just was delivered this smart contract with specification. That's basically it. We didn't write it. So they explained that there are 4 events that we're going to look for. So these 4 right here, starting from game created, we have player joined the game, we have player made a move, and finally we have a game over. So as you can notice the pattern, whenever something happens with the game itself, this contract will emit some event. So starting from our game created, so you can see we can create a new game right here. When that happens, the contract will emit this event and return the information such as game ID and the address of the creator. And now imagine that I created the game, I send you the link to join the game. When you join the game, this event is going to be emitted. And finally, we have when somebody of us play a move, that's when we have this event for. And if the game ends in whatever resolution, is it like you or I, or it was a draw, this event is going to be emitted, be a game over. So since we are kind of a time constraint today, I'll try to write functions, Web3 actions for first two events. So I call you to, if you want to expand the knowledge from today's session, go on your own time and try to write actions for these 2. So you can do all of that for the free account, so you don't have to pay anything. But basically, that's something as an exercise if you obviously want to expand on today's session. Cool. So now that we have this, let's go to our dashboard. So for today's session, I completely defined a new project called Web3 Actions Webinar. So it's for us here only. And the only thing that I've done pre-session, I imported this contract that I showed you right now from Goerli Network, as you can see right here, already to this project. So if you're not familiar with Tenderly, basically, if you want to interact with some contracts with any tool in our disposal, you need to import that contract to the system before. Cool. So I've already done that, and we can jump to actions tab. And as you can see, since this is a completely new project, I don't have any action in this project defined. And now the next step that we are going to explore is how to create a Web3 actions. We already know that there are 2 moving parts, trigger and action function, but we don't know where to put them, So there are 2 different ways to define your Web3 actions for your project. One is using our dashboard, which is a simpler one, which is just by clicking this blue button. And we're going to do that in a second. The more comprehensive one and more the option that provides you with more flexibility in defining is to use the code and Tenderly CLI. And that's for more advanced examples. So to create the first Web3 actions, you can follow along. Just click your add action here, and it will start the wizard for creating an action. The first thing that we need to do is to choose the trigger. So when something will happen. Let's define the simplest one on the block. So when the block gets mined, we are going to console log something, for example. And you can notice here that you can select all of these that we mentioned previously, but this transaction one, which we want to work up to in this webinar. So the transaction event is only available through CLI. So if you want to integrate directly with your project, this is the trigger that you will most likely use there. Okay. So in the block one, when I select the trigger type, it will prompt me to the next step and say, hey, what is the code that you want to run? So in this case, it's already pre-populated, and this already follows all the things that I mentioned that needs to be defined so that one action is recognized as a Web3 action. And I'll just change this to log hello world. Okay, so once the block gets mined, we'll set up everything about details and which network to follow and stuff like that in a second. But once that happens, we're just going to log hello world. That's it, the simplest example out there. I click next, and it will prompt me to the next step where you have an option to define like what is the behavior that you want to reflect in your trigger. So our trigger, I like to have this in a mainnet, for example. So I'll monitor the mainnet, and I'll set, let's say, every 4 blocks. So every 4 blocks, when added to the mainnet, this trigger will happen, and my code, which just prints out the hello world, will occur. Cool. This is only for you, so I'll define the name. So in this case is, let's say, test action, and I'll create it. Okay. So it will be deployed in a second, but while that happens, we'll go back to Actions tab. As you can see here, this is our first action that is defined. It will be deployed in a second, and we can monitor that in a bit. So you can see it's done. Okay, so we just created the first action, and after a couple of minutes, we'll have some happening inside of it, and we'll explore that in a bit. But while that happens, let's go back to the code itself and see how to work this example from the CLI. So I'll switch to my my editor, and it has 2 files open, and many of them close right here. So I know it looks a bit scary, so let me explain what's happening right here. So if you never worked with Tenderly CLI before, once you set up, we have amazing documentation for that. So it will lead you step by step on how to install it and set up your personal account and stuff. So you don't have to worry about that right now. But once it's done, you need just to run like this command, Tenderly actions init, and it will initialize the project for you. It will create all of these files for you, and you are basically good to go for implementation on site. In most cases, you're going to interact with 2 files. Tenderly examples.ts, once you create a new project, it will be called examples.ts. I just rename it to tic-tac-toe actions, just to reflect what is our goal here. And on the right-hand side, we have Tenderly YAML file. In the TypeScript file, you're going to define your Web3 actions functions. So what is your logic? What's going to happen when something occurs? On the right-hand side, that's where you can define detailed configuration for your triggers. So you can go and define, like we did in the UI, a block event that occurs on the mainnet with, for example, every 4 blocks being mined. So these 2 files are the most important for our project. And while that happens, the rest files are supporting ones. So I won't go into details for them right now, but most of them are just for Node.js as a supporting files. The only thing that I imported here as a file that is not common is this tic-tac-toe.json. And that is an API for the contract that I just showed you. So whatever mean you use to deploy your contract, it will potentially spill out some file like this, and you can save it in a JSON format and put it right here. And why I'm doing that? Because I want to interact with it. So I'm going to use ethers.js to interact with it, to create an interface, and you will see all of that in a second. Okay, so to sum up what happened so far, we are going to work with these 2 files. So in the left side, I'm going to write the functions themselves, and the logic will happen there. On the right-hand side, we'll define the configuration for each of the parts of the code that we are going to write. And to speed up the process, I have some scripts that I'm going to run. Let me initialize everything. And it will create some code for us. And I can close all of this right now because we are going to interact with only these two files. So for the import side, we have stuff that is imported from Tenderly actions, starting from our action function, that is the type that we are going to use. Then for our parameters, we have context and our events. And finally, we have the trigger type. So as we talked about, there are 4 types, main types, and the transaction one is to monitor for events emitted, and that's what we're going to use. We imported ethers, then we imported our ABI from this tic-tac-toe.json and some helper functions. So in the GitHub repository that you got, you have these functions as well, so you can use them from those files. On the right side, we have the starting point of our configuration. So as you can see, start by my username, the project name, and the rest are a bit like just the definition of what is the engine and the version of it. For that, I encourage you to go to our documentation for tenderly.yaml, and it will explain each piece and how it integrates to our engine and where to find, for example, why is V1 there and so on. So just for the sake of time, I'll skip that explanation for now, but just for your understanding, go to documentation and basically you will learn for each of these steps. Okay, let me integrate, let me define new game now, and it will populate 2 things right here. Okay, this one is not properly indented, so I'll just do that. Okay, so we have our first function, first action function right here. I'll zoom out a bit so you can see better. If it's too small, please write in the comments so I can check. I can zoom in again. But as you can see, this function already follows all the things that we talked about. It is exported, so our engine can recognize it. It has a name. It's a new game action. It's not that descriptive, but hey, it works. It's an action function, and it's asynchronous. And one of the things that we mentioned that is important, it has 2 parameters, context and event. So in the logic right here, you can see that first line is the event, which uses this second parameter, which is the event. And here we are basically casting this event to the type that we want to use. In this case, it's transaction event. So if you were to use a block event, you would cast that to the block event. And this is the first thing that you are going to use so you can interact with our system. These pieces of code, the next, they are not unique to Web3 actions. These are all things that are connected to the ethers.js. So if you worked previously, this is really common to you. So in the line here, we are using ethers to create an interface for our ABI. Then we are decoding that log and waiting for the event with name game created, extracting the data from it, and then finally pushing it to some storage. Okay, so wait, this is the first time that we are using context. Cool. So this is, if you remember, there are 2 parameters, context and event. So context is the thing that we are going to use to interact with other parts of the system. One part is called secrets, and the next part is called storage. So secrets are there to act as a .evn file. So if you were to, for example, call an API when something happens on chain, you could do that. And for that, for example, you need an API key. And obviously, we don't want to store that in some kind of a repository. So you can do that with our secrets part of our Web3 actions. Storage part is there to preserve small bits of information, so you can use that between the execution of these functions. So in the example right here for our tic-tac-toe example there, we want to preserve the information about the game state. So if I play the move, your version of the state is not the same. So you need somehow to get my version so you can play with it. So you can't play the same move that I just did. So that's why we want to store that game state, which we do right here in this line. So we are storing that with a specific game ID, and that's basically putting that in storage. We're going to explore the storage later on. But just so you know, to sum up for the storage, it's a small bits of information in the format of key value pair, and that's it. On the right-hand side, we have a bit scary looking configuration for this function. So under specs, you're starting by defining the first node, which is just a name for you to recognize this function. This is important for you since this will be reflected in our dashboard. So whatever you put under here as a name, it will be, when deployed to our servers, it will basically follow that naming and use that as a name. Then description is just there to describe and give more context for your team, for example. And function here is arguably one of the most important things that you need to set up, because it will connect the code, the function itself that we defined right here on the left side, to this configuration. So we'll say the file name. In this case, it's tic-tac-toe actions, as you can see right here. And under that file, we are looking for a function with new game action, which reflects the one right here. So these two needs to be the same. Okay, after we successfully found what's the source code here, we need to define the trigger. So in this case, we are using transactions. So it's always the type that you're going to define first. So as you can see, there are multiple types. You're going to say, okay, our type for this function, for this action is the transaction one. And under that, you can go in details to specify what is the behavior of this trigger. So in this case, we are waiting for statues to be mined of the block. We are under filters. We are waiting for the network, in this case, ID 1. We are going to change that in a second. And we are waiting for event to be emitted for the contract under this address with this name. So by default, it's set up here to be network with ID 1, but I deploy this to the Goerli, which has the ID of 5. So I'm just going to change that, and we are good to go. Okay, so we now have understanding of both sides for one single Web3 action. So we have a code, we have a configuration, and we are ready to deploy this. So here, I'm just going to write tenderly actions deploy. And it will take everything, package up, and push it to the server and detect how many of these things we need to deploy. In this case, only one with a new game. If I go to here again, you can see that it's already recognized as a new action, and it will take some time to deploy it. Already deployed. Great. It's really fast. Cool. Before we jump to deploying a second one, which is player join the game, let's interact with this one. So from the remix, I'll just create a new game. So I'm clicking the new game. It will open my MetaMask. It's off screen. Sorry for that. I'll confirm the transaction. It will take some time to push the new transaction. While that happens, we'll save time by going back to our code and just create a new action. So let me run another script. Okay, so you can see that this is how you build your backend. Now I defined another functionality that we are going to use. In this case, we are waiting for event called player join the game, and this function has a bit more information to it, but in the like nutshell, it's basically the same as the first one. The only exception is we are getting information from the storage and pushing that, updating basically that information with the new player. That's the only thing that we are doing in this function. For the configuration end, we have everything the same except the names. So you can see that it still follows the same convention. The network is 1, so let's change it to 5. And that's it. So everything else stays the same as we described in the first one, except the fact that it's the different event. But basically, you can see that with this pattern, you can build more and more functions. So let me deploy that again. But now the system will recognize there are 2 functions to deploy. As you can see here, new game and player joined, and it's done, deployed. So if I go here in actions, you can see that the new one is detected. Great. We made a move, we created a game, and you can see that execution history is there. It succeeded. So let's see what actually happens. If I go to execution history, you can see every time that this function is triggered and when that was happening, like how many minutes ago, and so on. If I go inside of this transaction, you will see that, hey, this is a payload. Somebody sent a transaction to it with a lot of information. And here is the log. Like, we created a new game with a specific ID, and this is my address because I created this game. And one thing that we can reflect on and see here for this transaction is to storage itself. So if I created everything right, this event should have created new storage entry, in this case ID 3, because I experimented before. And basically you can see here that we created a new game, so there are no players joined this game. And we have board with basically all zeros because none of us actually played any move. So that's it. Like, you successfully defined this function and pushed it to, so we can see this happening in the storage itself. Okay. So that's it. To sum up before we close, we went to created a slideshow. We created 2 separate action functions. We triggered one just by sending the transaction to the chain, and that our system recognized that and created additional functionality around it and run it. That's it. So thank you so much for listening through the demo. And if you have any questions, this is the part to ask.
All right, thanks, Luca. Thanks so much for this amazing presentation and demo. Really useful stuff. Hope everyone enjoyed it. And just a quick reminder that we shared in the chat the GitHub repo where you can find code examples that Luca worked on here. Now let's turn to some questions. If you haven't already, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box here on Zoom. We'll do our best to go through as many as possible. If you don't get to any of those, we'll try and send them to you, or you can just email us at support@tenderly.co and our engineers will send over the answers. So let's go through a couple. So Luca, I have one question here. So what happens if an event gets dropped?
So basically we implemented a set of checks that cannot happen. Like, if either it's going to fail in the sense of not having the information right, or basically that's going to be your problem, and that's going to create an issue so you can explore and run it. But in a nutshell, it cannot be dropped. It will be always executed. The outcome can be failed or success.
All right, thanks so much. Let's jump to another question here. So what happens if my action function code fails?
So let me go, sorry for that, it's another slide. If I go to my here dashboard again, there is error report. So once the function fails, it will create an issue for you to debug and see why it happened. So under error reports, for now, we didn't have any errors, unfortunately, but basically when that happens, it will be here for your team to recognize and go and debug it. And we'll try with our interface to help you as much as possible to understand what was the error. But as always, like, if you don't know, you can always reach our support team.
All right, great. And let's do one more for the sake of time. So I want to do a simulation with an action. Is there an API available for action functions?
So as I didn't try that myself, but as I'm aware, I think so. There is a way. I'll need to get back to that example. You can reach out to me on the Discord, and I'll provide you direct example of how to do that. But one of the things that we want to do in the near future is to be able to expose the simulations in the actions as well, like forks and stuff, so you can interact with them as you would with a regular network.
All right, thanks so much. So that's all the time we have for the questions. Our Nanad is here as well. He's typing answers to some of the questions that we're getting here in the chat as well. We'll do our best to get those answers to you after the webinar if we don't get to them here. But if you have any additional questions that come to mind, feel free to email support@tenderly.co, and our engineers will get to your answer. So I want to send a big thanks to all of you who sent us questions, for attending this webinar. We'll email you the recording right after this. And also I want to thank Luca for the great presentation and demo. And just a heads up, we'll have another webinar coming up very soon. So follow us on Twitter and Discord to stay up to date with the latest from Tenderly. So thank you all for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you soon. Bye-bye.